Hey, welcome to Cafe Maddy. My name is Maddie, and you're tuning into an emotional food podcast series where you send me an order in story form, and in return, I make something customized and delicious for you. You can submit your story in the link below in the description if you're watching on YouTube, and you can tell me about something you're going through, any questions you might have in general. And every week, I'll carefully pick an order and you get a custom menu along with a podcast about my own life. If you haven't already, you can find this podcast in audio form on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, hit that 5-star button so more people can enjoy the podcast. And on YouTube, you'll be able to actually see me talking and cooking as well. So before we start, I just want to thank you guys for being patient with our unexpected break last week with the podcast. And since it's been a few days now, I'm finally able to kind of look back and actually understand what happened internally. But basically, I was feeling very anxious about a lot of things to the point where I kind of lost sight of what I was actually anxious about. And to be honest with you, the anxiety has been slowly but surely building up for a few months. And I unknowingly slipped from all my good habits of working out, eating well, praying, journaling. And it finally kind of took a toll on me last week. And I was physically feeling so unhealthy and mentally drained and a little bit overwhelmed. And I had the story already written, but when it comes to content, I'm a huge believer of creating from a good place, mentally and emotionally. And it doesn't matter if the video turns out great, but I want to be creating and putting out things from a good state of mind. And I really think it shows in very subtle ways. It makes a difference whether or not people can see it. So it took me a few days for me to sort things out internally, and now I'm back. So yeah, that was my little update on what's going on with Maddie's life. How are you guys? Had a good week? Let's jump into the podcast. I have a really special one for you today. So thank you for coming to Cafe Maddy, and take a seat wherever you are. Make yourself at home and let me take your order. So today we have a very heartbroken 26-year-old customer. She submitted the order anonymously, and it says, "Hi Maddie, I'm currently going through a breakup and each waking day is a torture. I'm a crying mess, barely getting any work done, and I'm just not here at work or anywhere. I feel like a zombie, to be honest with you, and I miss my ex so much, I can't seem to think about anything else. I don't know how I'm gonna get through this. I know it's not the end of the world, but I'd love to hear if you have any advice on getting over someone. Much love, from New York." This is the kind of pain where you only know if you know. I think when you're going through something like this, there will only be two types of people you'll encounter when you open up about the pain. People who've been through it and people who haven't. And my dear friend, your order, it brought me back to a very specific night in my 20s. It was like you suddenly hit a rewind button in my head, and I zoomed out of this apartment and out of Brooklyn, back to my old apartment, back to my commute to my college library, all the way back to 23. And when in movies where the footage is kind of like in reverse and people are going backward and you get this tape warping sound? It brought me back to those few hours where I remember down to the second of the moment my heart was broken. Emotional memory is the strongest memory I have. And of course, I remember. I remember the first time my heart was broken. And I'm making beignets today. That same night, I sat at this French beignet joint near campus, this street full of eateries called McDougal Street. And with a little array of freshly fried beignets with a soft mound of powdered sugar on top, with this delicious treat just sitting before me on the table, I had my best friend next to me, and she broke the news to me, and my world started caving in. So when I think of that terrifying night, I think of beignets, but I put a twist to it, and I made them black sesame beignets. I'll show you how I made them, shall we? So I'm going to tell you this whole story, but I'm not going to go into detail about what happened with the breakup and the relationship because that's not really important. What's important is what I wish I knew back then as I was navigating my first ever heartbreak and a beautiful moment that still happened during it. And most importantly, what I would love to sit and talk about with our customer here who's hurting right now. So let's go back to that beignet joint. It was my best friend next to me who delivered the news that things were over, he was seeing someone else, and unfortunately it happened that way where I had to hear it from somebody else. And I told you, the world just started caving in. And I had never experienced like a sudden severing of a relationship like that before. And I was at first shocked at this type of pain and the sheer amount of pain that was happening all of a sudden. And usually with like a very intense and extreme situation or emotion like this, it always took a day or two for me to process and actually feel it. But this one just dropped like a bomb, like a tsunami. And if I was a planet, as it was sweeping over me, I felt like every little tree, every little street and house get crushed and everything in me kind of hurt. And tears were like gushing out of me. And I still remember the pain. And when I talk about it, it still makes me tear up a little bit just from the sheer physical memory of it. Although I really have no emotional ties to the person or situation anymore. It was terrible because it was a day before our final exam too. So I had to send my best friend back to the library so she could study. And I decided I could not. So I walked home. I lived like a 30-minute walk from the library. And so my entire walk back, I was just crying and crying and crying, sobbing and ugly crying every step of the way. Do you ever see people crying in public? Or have you ever cried in public? I'm not talking about like shedding a tear in public. I'm talking about like ugly, sobbing, crying. I never really understood it until I was there. And I don't even remember anything on my way home until the very specific block, this block on 1st Avenue and 14th Street in New York, where all the fluorescent lights from like smoke shops and fast food restaurants are everywhere, and it's like bright as day in the middle of the night. And that's when I called my good friend. I asked him to meet me at the park near our apartment. And I think I said something like, "Can you bring me tissues? I'm crying a lot." And so we sat at the bench in the dark. Him just like a normal dude, not knowing what to say. And the reason I called him was because I was so scared to return to my apartment. I was so terrified of having to continue with my life while feeling this intense pain. And through the sobbing and crying, one of the things I said to him was, "I don't want to wake up tomorrow hurting like this. I'm so scared of going home, knowing it's not going to go away when I wake up tomorrow." And that was the very essence of why the first heartbreak was so scary for me. I had never gone through it before, so I didn't know what to expect. And the unknown was terrifying. I didn't know how sad I was going to be the next morning, the next day, the next week, or whether I'll even feel better or worse. I didn't know if I was going to start crying at school or work. The fear of the unknown was really the worst thing about my first breakup. And so I want to tell you about a few very important things that I learned that helped me through my next few breakups and the next one. And believe it or not, I think I became good at heartbreaking. Trust me, the pain of grieving a relationship didn't hurt any less all the subsequent breakups, but it did get a lot easier. And I'll tell you what I mean. I'm sure you already know the basics of the stages of grief or whatnot, so I'm not going to talk about that. If you don't know about the stages of grief and you're going through a breakup, stop this video now and please look up the 5 stages of grief that your brain is about to chemically go through, okay? Mine followed the exact pattern to a T on a weekly cycle, so it really helps to understand your pattern of emotions. Anyways, here we go. Maddie's Heartbreak Manual. So number 1. The most important thing is being able to see the end of the tunnel. It's easier to say it than to really believe it when you're in the middle of it, especially when you're in the thick of the pain and the heartbreak. To really know that after all, you're going to be okay, that takes a lot. And that night, when I felt the kind of grief that I've never felt before, I had no idea if I was going to be okay and around when I could expect to stop hurting. And this is kind of cheesy, but I didn't know if I'd be able to love again. And that was a fear that was unbearable for me. But after that first time, the second and third time I went through relationships, it was so much easier to face my pain, knowing that after some nights of crying, missing him, blah, 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 that I was eventually going to be fine. And when I was still going through this the first time, you know what helped me? Reading about other people's lives. Women older than me who have gone through multiple relationships of being madly in love with different partners. Women who have gone through divorce and breakups in their youth. Particularly, I was reading this book called Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed, one of my favorite authors. And her love life is only a small part of the picture in this book, but it still helped me a lot. At the time, to know that even after all that, she was strong and beautiful and she was okay. So this made me start to believe that this was only the first one, maybe last, or maybe one of many. And because at the time I didn't have that many friends who I could really talk to about this, reading helped me a lot. And number 2, another thing that I wish I could tell my 23-year-old self is that heartbreak isn't going to make a linear progress. And because of the way I was raised, I naturally draw identity from being productive and making progress, right? Even to this day, I'm in a much better mood on days when I'm productive and I feel like shit when I'm not. So when I was dealing with this new thing called breakup or heartbreak, I measured my success in progress. Progress in getting over this guy. Progress in feeling better. Progress in moving on. What I didn't know is that the trajectory of my emotions was going to be more like a wavelength, hitting a high point and a low point and a high point and a low point over again. And the reality is that I would never just go on an incline and feel better and better and better and better as time goes by. But it was going to be more like a crazy up and down in the beginning, which will be less frequent as time goes by. So the frequency in which I hit a low point, the low point of feeling depressed, missing my ex a lot, crying and feeling hurt and feeling angry, the frequency of feeling low will be less, but not the extent. Does that make sense? In other words, the same low that I felt initially, I would feel it often in the beginning. After a month or 2 months, I would only feel that bad only once in a while. It didn't mean the low point was any better than how it was in the beginning. It just meant that I felt this way less frequently. But without knowing this, guess what I did? I would start feeling better, work out, work on my career, and then boom, one day I'm all sad again. And I thought I was back to square one. And I thought that all that progress that I made, it was useless. And what I really should have said to myself was, wow, I haven't felt this sad or missed him in a while. I've really come a long way. This is a great sign. This is what I should have said. And there will always be toxic people around you saying toxic things like, oh my God, you're still not over him. And there are likely people who have never gone through a breakup or heartbreak. So just ignore them, okay? Just know that the frequency will be less, but once in a while you will hit that low point, but it'll just plateau out as time goes by. Time really heals. And this leads us into the third point of having grace. Don't beat yourself up. Have grace. You listened to the last episode, right? Be kind to yourself. Imagine you're your own mother and celebrate the baby steps that you're taking and give yourself a shower, go for a walk, drink some water, and do not beat yourself up while you're healing. And here's another thing. I've actually never met anyone who said they could relate to this, so maybe it's just me, but understanding your mood swings depending on the time of day, this helps a lot. I don't really know about you, but I think I've always been this way. But it really became more apparent during a hard time, and it's that I'm most emotionally sensitive in the morning time, the moment that I wake up. And all the negative emotions that I have going on just swarm up to me in the morning. But a few hours after I wake up, I don't know what it is. I can physically feel my emotions a lot more calm, and I can go on with my day. So before I really learned my own mood cycle or habit, I woke up thinking there was no way I was going to get anything done today. I woke up so depressed and so beaten down that I couldn't see myself achieving anything for the rest of the day. But once I learned that by like 10 a.m., the fog kind of lifts and I'm usually like 80-90% fine, I set up a system for myself, which was really simple. I put a little sticky note next to my nightstand so that when I roll over from my bed, it will be the first thing I see in the morning. And I kid you not, the sticky note, it said, Maddie, I know you feel sad right now, but you're feeling this way because it's the morning time. And in a few hours, you're going to be fine. You're going to be totally fine. And waking up to see this little note, it really helped me so much. So, understanding your chemical pattern, whether it's dependent on the time of day, what you eat, or who you talk to and what gets brought up in the conversation, because sometimes I would accidentally bring him up in conversation thinking that I could casually talk about him again, but then quickly realize it would ruin my whole day. So things like that, small triggers like that, you have to be kind of aware and learn about yourself, what triggers you and when you feel sad. And then once you learn the triggers, set up a system for yourself to get yourself out of that ditch or get yourself out of that situation. And you will really thank yourself later on. And here's my very, very last tip. And it might be the most practical one for all of us busy people who not only have to be heartbroken, but also do school, work, and run errands at the same time. I mean, you're suffering, but you're not gonna just not show up to work, right? So I actually learned this from Googling. When I couldn't possibly focus on work at work, I Googled how to get over someone. And don't underestimate Google, guys. A lot of great life advice I ever got came from Google. And at the time, the first thing that came up was wikihow. Have you ever searched something and landed on wikihow? It's kind of like a Wikipedia for instructions on how to do anything and everything. And they had this 3-part instruction page on how to get over someone. And it's actually quite good. So whoever is curious, I'm going to drop the link in the description of this video on YouTube. Okay, check it out. And out of all the things that were listed, one part really stuck out to me, and it's something I put into action to this day. And it was step 8 of part 1 that said, limit the amount of time you wallow in grief. Or more specifically, how I understood it was to set a specific time during the day to allow yourself to feel sad. And for me, it worked like magic. For example, I decided I'm gonna let myself feel all the pain but only from 8 p.m. and onward. So when the tears started like creeping up on me in the middle of the day at work or at school, I would be able to tell myself, stop. I'm gonna think about this later at 8 p.m. And I'm gonna be all depressed, but at 8 p.m., not now. And this was so much more effective than like trying to blindly suppress my feelings indefinitely or putting pressure on myself to be fine after the breakup. So yeah, that's my little heartbreak manual for you. I have a feeling that if I ever have a daughter one day, she might be just like me, like emotionally. And before I send her out to the world, to college maybe, if college is still a thing by then, I'll send her this old YouTube video from the archives. So there I was, 23, sobbing and falling apart in the dark on a park bench, next to my friend who might have had no idea why I was crying. I just kind of assumed that my best friend gave him a heads up as I was walking home that day. Or maybe I felt more comfortable that he didn't know. And I told him, his name was Jonathan, I said, Jonathan, I don't want to wake up tomorrow with all this pain. And he handed me the tissue and napkins that I told him to bring me. And I'll never forget what he did. It was so strange. I've cried like this to some of my friends before. And each time my sweet girlfriends, they'd always like listen to me, try to comfort me, and do something to make me feel better, buy me food. But Jonathan just sat there and he started talking and rambling about random stuff as I cried and cried and cried. I wouldn't tell him what really happened, and I was too hurt to even talk about it. I just wanted to cry but not be alone. So Jonathan didn't ask me anything. Completely unfazed by my meltdown, he started to tell me about his day. What he did with his friends, how his friends were visiting in New York for the weekend. So he took them around. He got an air mattress for them to stay at his place. He talked about the quality of the air mattress, the restaurants they went to, how some were actually not that good, but this one place was good, and what about that place made it good. And the entire time that he was talking, I was bawling. And he let me cry like no one else had ever had before. And when I was done crying, because I ran out of tissue, I blew my nose with my last remaining crumpled up piece of tissue, and he walked me home. And the next few months were as terrible as a heartbreak gets. But eventually I healed, moved on, and I even went through a couple more, and I'm fine now. But when I look back on that time period, that memory of me crying on the bench with Jonathan, it's there just glistening like a jewel, like one of those gems stuck in a rough patch of rocks, Time to time, I'm so glad I had people next to me in my most vulnerable of moments. These memories, they all look back at me, just glistening like gems. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It was a really special one and something very, very personal to me. And if you'd like to leave a review of the podcast, I would love to hear it, so feel free to comment down below. Let me know if you have any tips on heartbreak and how to heartbreak well and how to heal well. And you can also find the podcast on Spotify and Apple Music under the title, The Cafe Maddy Podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please go ahead and hit that 5-star button. Those of you who rated the podcast, thank you so much. And big shout out to the username Nacho Huzur, who left an amazing review on Apple Podcast. Thank you so much. So you guys know the usual. Like, share, subscribe, and most importantly, turn on the alarm so you stay tuned for next week. Same day, same time. Special thanks to our music artist, Mr. Hong, for the custom track for our podcast. And every week, I'll introduce a track that I like that you might like too. So I'll link the playlist right here on the screen in the corner, and every week we'll be building a playlist from this podcast. So that's it for today. Thanks for coming by. See you next week.